Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, and the Conscious Party Productions. You are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast.
A conscious party.
Revolutionizing our minds.
Elevating our consciousness.
Changing our worlds.
Your story.
My story.
Our story.
Social workers want to help people, but we often end up, just working at, not just, but falling into, working as a part of as a cog within the system, sometimes some people might say an agent within the system, whether that's intentional or unintentional. But how did you, get into this, this angle of social work? What made you want to go into Dissent?
I guess just by way of kind of an introductory kind of comment, I suppose I realised that, my experience of working in the UK, of working in Ireland, is not going to be the same as working in Alaska, working in the States, or working elsewhere in Europe, or indeed in China. So I suppose that's just a little by way, I guess, of a health warning. That I suppose it's acknowledging what's often referred to as issues around kind of positionality and so on. And I guess also in that regard, I'm a man in the field of social work. This is predominantly a field of women workers as well. I think in the States it's over 80%. I guess in Ireland, the UK is the same. So it's kind of acknowledging that as well. To address your question directly, though, in terms of issues around dissent, I guess a number of things feeding into my interest there. One of them is, on one level, social work seems to be in kind of spectacularly great shape if one simply looks at the numbers. I was reading earlier, I think in the States the profession is expected to grow something like 7% over the period 2022 to 2032. We have a boom in social work numbers in the People's Republic of China and so on. So on one level, I suppose there's a risk of kind of complacency in terms of if one just looks at the numbers. So the other kind of element which kind of led to my interest in questions of dissent is there are kind of debates around now, despite the increase in numbers, as to whether social work is a failure, whether the profession should be ended. And I guess a number of people are arguing that line, are suggesting not unreasonably, that social work is failing to live up to its ideals, to its values. If one looks at the International Federation of Social Work's definition of the profession, it highlights issues to do with human rights, social justice, human liberation. And I guess a number of the critics of social work, often within academic social work, are suggesting that, these words are not being kind of delivered on. And in that sense, I guess they would point to historical factors to do with issues around colonialisation, to do with the treatment of indigenous peoples, and so on and so on. The fact that within the area of child protection, many maybe parents are fearful of the intervention of social workers, perhaps oftentimes because that form of intervention is kind of heavily kind of racialised, and so on. So there's a stack of arguments being deployed to suggest the profession should simply end or be abolished. And I suppose that led me to think more about questions of dissent, because I guess in part I'm accepting the critique that's been levelled of social work, But I'm also suggesting that the notion of ending the profession takes us into a cul-de-sac. I guess aside from anything else, the notion that social work would end is, it's kind of highly unlikely given the investments that states make in the profession. So that led me to kind of gravitate towards ideas of trying to think about how we may remake social work, how the profession might think about becoming more critical, becoming more dissenting, and so on. So in a fairly long-winded way, I guess, Christian, that's how I ended up at, this notion of trying to encourage us dwelling on the idea of trying to shift the focus of the profession in perhaps a more dissenting way.
This episode was recorded live on Wednesday, April 17th, 2024. This episode featured Dr. Paul Michael Garrett, and it was hosted by Christian Ace Stetler. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, this has been a Conscious Party production. You've been listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. Your story, my story, our story. All right, until next time, everybody, keep being revolutionary. Peace.